Ladies and gentlemen, as promised, a very special guest and an esteemed colleague and a hero of mine, Jennifer Marohasy, is live from tomorrow in the future on the other side of the planet. Now, if you don't know Jennifer, she's an Australian biologist, a columnist, prolific blogger, and she's all over the place. She's been a senior fellow at the free market think tank that many of you are aware of, the Institute of Public Affairs, from 2004 to 2009, and the director of the Australian Environment Foundation until 2008. She has a PhD in biology. She studied midges and reefs and all kinds of things. And she has an awesome website at jennifermarohasy.com. She just put out her first film, Beige, Reef, which is getting mixed reviews, as you can imagine, because we're going to talk about some evidence about the so-called unprecedented sea level rise around the world that many of you, that's being fed to many of you by the mainstream. And here, Jennifer, before I introduce you, you're looking at yesterday, this article came out, unprecedented and worrying rise in sea level poses serious threat to coastal cities. And this is just some of the nonsense that we're going to be unraveling in this interview. It's a pleasure to have you on this show. How you doing?
Put a shirt on, so I'm so
Before we started here, we were discussing the fact that there's some fires going on over there, and they're saying that these are unprecedented fires. So let's talk a little bit about the bushfires.
so we have had a really bad start to the bushfire season here in Australia, and there has been, well, people have been talking about it's been unprecedented and how we've had 17 lives lost. In fact, if you go just back 10 years, we had 173 lives lost in the bushfires back in February 2009. And every so many years we have a bad bushfire season, and we have lives lost, and we have hundreds and thousands of hectares burnt. But it's not unprecedented, and after every inquiry that follows these bad bushfire seasons, we're told that the solution is more controlled burning, more hazard reduction burning, and yet it doesn't happen. My father lived through horrific bushfires back in January 1939. Back then, mid-January of that year, 2 million hectares burnt, and ash and ember was recorded as falling on New Zealand. And people are saying that it's unprecedented now when we've had less area burnt, but they are talking about smoke getting to New Zealand. There seems to be a reluctance to talk about how hot it was, for example, back in January 1939 was probably our hottest summer, at least for the southeast of Australia, in the last 100 years. January 1939, if you look at the unadjusted temperature record. And I think back then it was exceedingly hot as well in the United States. And of course, there was the John Steinbeck novels about drought and dust bowls, and Tony Hellier's provided a lot of data showing that were really, really hot years back then in the 1930s in the States, wasn't there?
Absolutely. Not only that, I thought you or him uncovered the fact that some of the penciled in highest temperatures ever, the bomb actually erased some of the 1890 data because it didn't fit their narrative. You froze up a little, Jennifer. Are you still with us?
1896. Yep.
Okay.
If we go back 96, we had some weeks then in January 1896 which were exceptionally hot, and we had people evacuated by train from regional centres in Western New South Wales. So this is going back to 1896. Now, back then, temperatures were recorded using mercury thermometers, but many of them weren't in Stevenson screens. So the Bureau of Meteorology will say, well, it was hot back then, but not as hot as it is now because they weren't recording in Stevenson screens. We don't really know. The reality is, through that period from 1896 through the Federation drought, and even we've got when they were starting to put in Stevenson screens in 1909, we've got recordings, for example, from Burke, 51.7 degrees Celsius. So that's about 125 degrees Fahrenheit, or it is 125 degrees Fahrenheit because that's how they were recording back then. So that's probably the hottest day ever recorded in Australia in terms of using a mercury thermometer in a Stevenson screen at an official recording site. And for decades, that was in handbooks as the hottest official recording for anywhere in Australia. And then you know what the Australian Bureau of Meteorology did? It scratched that record. It's been removing these hottest records that occurred 100 years ago and coming up with all sorts of reasons. In the case of that 3rd of January 1909 record from Burke, they say, well, it was recorded on a Sunday and the meteorological shouldn't have been going in on a Sunday and recording temperatures because at that point in time, they weren't recording on Sundays.
Well, additionally,
just madness.
Aren't the Stevenson screens also shrinking in size, which would actually give elevated temperatures?
So back then it would have been a larger Stevenson screen than what they use now. So we had a mercury thermometer in a large Stevenson screen, and because that value's been removed from the database from which you can download temperatures, but it's still in the records, in the newspaper records. So I went to a lot of trouble to actually get access to the original book. So I made applications through the National Archive to find where the original recording book was. And then I actually went to this place on the outskirts of Sydney, and I got them to bring the book up for me. And I actually looked, and the handwriting, this person was recording for months the daily temperature from the mercury thermometer. And he went in on that day and he recorded the 125 degree Fahrenheit, 31.7 degrees Celsius, and he underlined it. And then he continued recording. And then at the end of the month, there was an audit. At the end of every month, these books were audited. And there was somebody that came along and ticked off that 125 degrees Fahrenheit was the highest temperature. That was 3rd of January 1909 was the hottest day for that month, and then that went in and was brought forward in their recording system at that time, which was, thank goodness, pen and paper. So they can remove it from what we call the CDO online database. But it's still there. It's still there in the archive, and I would like that reinstated as the hottest maximum temperature, the highest maximum temperature recorded in Australia, because there's absolutely no reason, no good reason, no scientific reason to remove it from the record books.
Well, we all know about the rule of Sundays, but I digress. So let us talk about what we came here for, and it is to expose the truth on the lies about the unprecedented nature of sea level rise. And in order to do this, you really need some context. Most of the articles being written about this are not based in any scientific fact. if you just go look at even the NASA NOAA data on sea level, since 1880, which is the end of the last cold period, the Dalton minimum, and the beginning of modern record keeping, sea level has risen and on average 2 to 3 millimeters per year, and with some fluctuation. There are multi-decadal cycles where sea level actually drops on these graphs and then rises again, but the average is around 3 millimeters per year. And if we look at the geologic, go ahead.
Just about those interdecadal, we can really see it. Oh, so sorry, this is the Holocene, but with the interdecadal, we can really see that with the coral bleaching recently, that corresponded with a drop in sea level with the recent El Nino event over here. So we had about a 30 plus centimeter drop in sea level, corresponding with what you're talking about, these interdecadal fluctuations. But locally there was no acknowledgement of that in the media, even though we could see it with the coral records that some of these corals exposed at these exceptionally low tides, they showed the recent drop associated with that lunar declination cycle.
Yeah, so we're talking about.
I interrupted you.
Yeah, but we're just getting to the facts that there are cycles upon cycles and scales. And if we really want to look at catastrophic sea level rise, we go back to the last glacial maximum here, 16,500 years ago, which is referred to as the Wisconsinian. And then there were a series of catastrophic pulses where sea level rose. In the first pulse, 15,000 years ago, it came up 70 feet in maybe 100 years. And then another rise, and then another rise. And within a 4,000 year period, sea level had come up 380 feet or more. Now that is catastrophic sea level rise, because the majority of the population lives within 100 feet of sea level. And that would have inundated every single coastal city on the entire planet in just 1,000 years. That's some sea level rise.
That is sea level rise, and that corresponded with the formation of the Great Barrier Reef, because a lot of places now where people go and snorkel or scuba dive, that of course was part of the continental shelf. That was, I understand it was fairly arid. We had open woodland, we had eucalypt trees. So our first Australians were having corroborees at these places, some of them in limestone caves that prior to that were coral reef, going back 120,000 years ago. So, yeah, most people don't realize, go back 20,000 years, 40,000 years ago, and much of the east coast of Australia extended out a lot further, and all of the current Great Barrier Reef was, there was remnant of previous reef there, but it was coastal plain, eucalypt, open woodland.
Amazing. And let's look at this next graph and let's talk about sea level fall, because we reached something called the Holocene high stand. At the end of that catastrophic sea level rise around 5,000 years ago, sea level was probably 2 to 6 meters higher than it is now. And there are some papers with cave deposits that we reported on the channel where you could have, 10 or 20 feet higher sea levels than currently. And you even have some evidence that shows that in Australia, of all places, because you guys are about to go, you're all going to go drowned, right?
So everybody's worried about what is a measurable, maybe 30 centimeters. So what's that? Not very much. Sea level rise, tiny sea level rise over the last 100 or so years. But the reality is, if you look at the longer record, the last few thousand years, and it's in the technical literature for describing sea level change along the east coast of Australia, but you can also see it in the landscape. what we've had, and the more relevant dialogue should be about the fact that we've had sea level fall of around 2 meters, 1 to 2 meters over the last few thousand years.
Well, and this evidence we're looking
So
at,
walk along.
yeah, it shows exactly that. And not only that, do you want to bring up those pictures now? Should we look at those?
Well, just while we've got that chart that you're showing everybody, Australia is very tectonically stable. We don't have a lot of movement of the continent because we didn't have glaciers. So as I said, the Great Barrier Reef was open eucalypt forest, whereas in other parts of the world there was ice that was pushing the land down. So now you've had some sort of some of the landscape, I understand, rising. I understand places like Scotland are actually rising because of the removal of the ice, whereas Australia is tectonically very stable, and from a, what do you call it, ISO whatever it is perspective, it hasn't moved very much. So when you look at high and low tide and the sort of decadal cycles along my coastline, you're really talking about sea level change rather than any movement in your landmass. That's what the technical literature says, and it talks about for places further north of me and further south of me, where there has been dating of the landscape, it comes back with the idea that we've had this approximate 2 meter drop. Yeah.
So if what you're saying is true,
So
and I believe you, Australia, in fact, the southeast would be one of the best places to actually do a scientific study on sea levels currently, and if they have risen or fallen in the past, because the isostatic condition is perfect. The continent is not rising or sinking for any known reason geologically.
that's correct. So we have a few places like Adelaide in the far south where they've been pumping groundwater out. So I understand there's some subsidence in that region. And locally, you can have a little bit of up and down. But generally speaking, and relative to most of the rest of the world, Australia is very stable. And certainly where I live, it's considered to be very stable. Yet when I walk along the seashore, what I can see is consistent with the technical literature and the chart that you're showing, that sea levels have fairly recently, last few thousand years, been much higher. But, try and talk to people about this, and you actually have to get them out on the beach before they'll even listen to you, because the media is continuously telling us that we've got sea level rise, and they're bringing in all these planning restrictions and other restrictions on the basis that we actually have significant rise in sea level at this point in time, when really the longer term trend is one of fall. And I did just this morning send you through some pictures by email. Maybe we have a look at the one of the cliff face to start with.
Okay, there's your shot of the cliff face.
So it's not coming. It's not coming up on my screen, but I know what it looks like because I walk across it often enough. So basically, not far from where I live is a place called Tea Tree Bay, which a lot of people. Oh, so that's the wave cut platform that's the cliff face. Yeah. So just to the northwest of Tea Tree Bay, if you go over that wave cut platform that you showed before and just scramble along the rocks, you'll come. The walking track's actually above this cliff face. You'll come to this cliff face, or you could scramble down from the walking track. So the tide never actually gets this high. The tide on our highest tides, and I go out there on the high tides, and we'll have another really high tide, 10th of February, and I'll go out and have a look. The highest tides only come to about 2 meters below below here. They don't actually get up onto this platform. When I bring geologists out here, they all tell me that it's a good example of how high the sea got during the Holocene high stand. And so, of course, the sea, the wave action ate away at the bottom of that cliff face and removed all the debris back into the sea, and you've got sandstone there, and the action of the surf over a long period of time just cut it down to that particular level. So I understand this is called a wave cut platform. I understand there's a lot of them along the coast of Australia, and where they have been dated, that it's Holocene high stand, and this is as high as the sea got. Some you're suggesting, I know they used to say it was about 4,500 years ago, but I think now they're saying it was about 7,000 years ago. Is that right? They're changing approximately when this high stand occurred in the technical literature.
Yeah, it's between 4,000 and 7,000, which is certainly in the past. And if you look at this picture, above your head, if you go up to the top about a meter here, there's a change in the way the lithology is. So actually, this wave cut platform, the water, the high level watermark is another meter above your head on the cliff, and which would be about the middle of the cliff. And that would be about, we're talking 3-4 meters above the current high watermark, that's a considerable amount of ocean, because you have to fill the whole world with that water. You understand?
Yeah. And so when do you think that happened? Or, I mean, we just need to get need to have a study done of this coastline so we really know what we're talking about in terms of timeframes, don't we?
Yeah, because that, like Robert Schoch redating the Sphinx, you would be the surface that you're standing on there has certain joint and fracture patterns, and you can see how the erosion has rounded them. You could easily figure out how many years it was covered and how long it took to smooth this platform. And based on what I'm looking at here, 5,000-7,000 years is completely right in the ballpark of when this could have happened.
So that's when that platform was formed, or when it went up that much higher?
Yeah, at the maximum extent, probably, because then you're going to have a period of a few thousand years with this dropping lower and lower and lower. And then at some point, only the platform itself where you're standing on is getting hit, and then it drops even further off there. Now, are there wave cut platforms at the current level below this?
So I need to do a bit more diving off that platform, which I'm planning to do. I've actually just got my scuba license in the last year. I've got my commercial drone pilot's license, and also my open water scuba license, because I'm planning to do a lot more adventures around the Great Barrier Reef and into the water and underwater. So I'm planning to jump off this platform and go underwater with an underwater photographer, but it hasn't happened yet. But maybe I can just show you the potholes just to the southeast, on a platform that's about the same height as this one, maybe a little bit lower. I sent you that picture through this morning. Yeah. Yes, Okay, so I sent my drone. I just love my drone because you can just get to you get a different perspective, don't you, when you send a drone up? Absolutely. So my drone skiddo went up and took this picture for me and a lot of other pictures, and I'm going to learn how to edit video so I can show you some video next time. But basically, if you look, say, in the middle of that picture, you've got that round, very, very almost perfect circle, and you can see, yeah, that that I understand is called a marine pothole, and it's a very perfectly formed one, and maybe a chunk of granite or something like that got caught in that softer sandstone and went round and round and round for a long period of time when all of this was underwater. Because I understand that you actually need that the churning and the grinding energy of a surf, of a submerged underwater environment to actually eat away. Raindrops aren't going to give you something like that. My understanding is that these are called marine potholes, and
Well, take a look
and they
in.
correspond with.
Take a look at the lower
You go.
pothole. If you look at the bottom, the one closest to the surf, it still has the rocks in it that scoured the hole. And then go directly above that. There's rocks in that one above it. You can see single rocks in these potholes. Those were the agents that were eroding it. And in order for those rocks to make that hole larger and more circular, the wave action would have to be 3 to 5 feet above the hole, and this is a high tide picture.
Wow.
So you need the ocean another 12 feet higher than it is to be scouring these potholes. Now, you told me there's even evidence that you've been there over a period of a year that these potholes never get seawater in them. The water that's in them now is rainwater, and there's actually polywogs in them. Isn't that correct?
So I sent you another picture, of me just sitting beside one of them. Don't know if you've got that one handy. It's a drone picture. At that time, there were little tadpoles, so frog larvae. So associated. So that means that it had been fresh water. For some weeks to get the I've actually got some pictures of the tadpoles that I can send you that developed in this fresh water. So I think that when we have our cyclones and our really big storms, we might get some seawater up there, but most of the time you've got fresh water in these potholes, and the evidence of that is these little tadpoles.
That's absolutely amazing. Now, is this part of your is going to be part of your new film on the Great Barrier Reef? And we're getting a sneak peek now. Is that what's happening?
So I'm not sure. Mostly, so the region where I live, Noosa, is actually a couple of 100 kilometers south of the southernmost portion of the Great Barrier Reef. So Lady Elliot Island is generally considered to be the southern end of the Great Barrier Reef. I'm actually looking, though I could include maybe some of this and maybe go right back in time, because Queensland, where I live, the state where I live, is so interesting, because if you go so way to the west of the Great Barrier Reef over what's called the Great Dividing Range, you have a history. You've got dinosaurs that have been uncovered there, and there was the Erromonga Sea and amazing huge reptiles. So I could...
Of course, right at the good part, you froze up when you were talking about reptiles. Are you still there?
Basically, just to try and be a bit more succinct, definitely planned with the next film is that I'm heading off to a place called Osprey Reef and also the Ribbon Reefs. So they are a good couple of 1,000 kilometres north of where I am. Australia's a large continent. I'm about halfway down the east coast. I'm going right up to the top and then right out to the continental shelf. And I'm going to, in a big boat with an underwater photographer for a week. And I'm hoping that we can actually get some pictures of they call them the divers talk about the walls at Osprey Reef. And in that, you've got evidence of the Pleistocene sediment, and then the current reef, of course, is the thin veneer over the top. But we'll hopefully get some evidence of sea level change over the what we're talking about, the last million years, but also over the last 10,000 years. And I'm hoping to also film some evidence of coral bleaching. Certainly there's been a lot published about how badly Osprey Reef was affected by the recent coral bleaching. So that was in the summer of 2015, 2016. And there's some technical papers coming out now talking about how 50% of Osprey Reef corals were totally destroyed. That's the technical literature. But if you actually talk to people in the dive community, they say it's beautiful that the ribbon reefs and Osprey Reef are still beautiful. Anyway, I'm going to go up there with an underwater photographer, and we will film what we see, what we find, and we'll make another film, and it's going to be very much about the current health of those reefs. But also maybe put some sea level change, geological history into the film, because we're right at the edge of the continental shelf. And my understanding is that in these underwater walls, these underwater cliff faces, we can get an idea of past sea level change.
Now, Jennifer, I have bad news. Your video froze up, so we're going to have to end this conversation. But we'll pick it up in a month or so when you're ready to share some of the video. Before we end, I want to talk a little bit about the problems in science. So if we could just, if you could sum it up a little bit, in the case of your film, The Beige Reef, you make the point that we can't even rely on peer-reviewed scientific literature. And I make the point on the show, like we point out physics.org is just a lot of times the papers they put out are not scientifically sound. They're based on propaganda, and it's to fit a narrative, and it's the funding narrative. So in order to get funding, you have to be doing certain research and showing certain results, unfortunately. And so okay, you're back. Your video's back. Excellent. So can you speak to that while we close up?
So the reason why I made the Beige Reef film was because Peter Ridd, my colleague, my close friend, was essentially fired from he was fired from James Cook University because he dared to question claims that all the corals around Stone Island had been destroyed as a consequence of global warming and declining water quality and ocean acidification. So he said that we need some quality assurance of the science, the reef science, and he used these photos that were being put around about how all the reefs around Stone Island had been reduced to mudflat. And we had this big court case, and he actually won the court case, but he hasn't got his job back, but that's another story. And at the end of the court case, they talked about whether he had a right to have an opinion and to say these things or not, but nobody actually went to Stone Island to see whether there was coral or mudflat there. And in the judgment, the judge actually said, well, because the university wouldn't actually address the issue, the judge asked several times, well, Peter Ridd said there's still coral in the vicinity of Stone Island. There's still good fringing coral reef there. And there's these technical papers and there's these pictures claiming that it's just mudflat. Anyway, but it wasn't resolved. That was in April of 2019. So less than a year ago, this judgment was handed down. And I was like, for goodness sake, I mean, I need to know what the story is. So I got on a train and I went up to Bowen, overnight train, and I went and I walked across the mudflat that had so many photos taken of it at low tide. I made sure I was there on a low tide. And then I found that the other side of the mudflat, there was so much coral. Now, this Stone Island has got what's called the Gloucester Passage backdrop, and so they had the picture of the mudflat, and then they had the Gloucester Island backdrop. In fact, there you can get at low tide, on the very low tides, you can get the coral and the Gloucester Island backdrop, which is what we've got photos from back in the 1890s. Pictures were taken back then, and so they've said, well, back in the 1890s there was coral, but there isn't now. There's mudflat. But you know, they just weren't walking the other side of the mudflat. Then Peter was making a fuss about that. They went and around.
You froze up a little bit. So these scientists are basically frauds, and they stop before they see the coral. Is that what's happening?
So that was Terry who took these pictures. That was that story. And then to try and back him up, they went round to another part of fringing coral reef around Stone Island, and they took some transects actually above now. So it's stranded reef. We were talking before about sea level fall. They took some transects, so they went out and measured, but they stopped before the reef edge, right? They stopped before the reef edge, where there's about 20 meters of healthy coral. And they had this paper published in Nature. And from these few transects that were from stranded reef, so from the higher sea level that's probably died because, you know, like sea levels have fallen, they had this paper published in Nature that basically says there's no acropora coral, and there hasn't been since at least 1994, fringing Stone Island. There's no Stone Island corals. And I went out, and so I went in April and I saw all this coral, and people said, well, you needed a drone and you needed an underwater photographer. So I went back in August with a drone and an underwater photographer, and I made Beige Reef, which is about just one of the fringing coral reefs, north-facing Bay, Stone Island, right close to where they took these transects published in Nature, claiming that all the corals, all the Stone Island corals, are now dead. Now, we found about 25 hectares in that bay. Go around the corner and you've got about 1.5 kilometres of fringing reef extending about 20 meters wide. Go across the channel, you're at Bramston Reef. You've got more, maybe 40 hectares of coral. Now, look at the peer-reviewed literature, and it says that all the coral's dead. Go there, and you will see beautiful fringing inshore corals, lots and lots of acropora, lots of turbonaria. And in the film, I draw some parallels between how the corals were described back in 1890 by William Saville Kent and what we filmed. So if people want to know more about, and I called it Beige Reef because this is a reef that apparently doesn't exist. There are a lot of corals that are beige in colour, so they may not make it onto the front of National Geographic because they like the really pretty colourful corals. But as I explain in Beige Reef, most corals are brown because the most common zooxanthellae in corals is a brown coral, but not all the corals are brown.
Not all corals are brown, and you froze up a little, Jennifer. But we're looking at the dead reef now, the Beige Reef, and it looks amazing. It looks quite alive and quite biodiverse.
It's exceedingly biodiverse, and please, just Google Beige Reef Jennifer Marohasy, and you should find the film on YouTube. It's only 12 minutes long, and you'll be able to see lots of beige acropora, which has got fluorescent purple tips. I just think it's beautiful, 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 beautiful.
Now, how can people support you in your work? We just had Tim Ball on the show, and he's another climate change denier like you and I. and he actually is winning his court cases against, of all people, Michael Mann, who happens to be currently in your neck of the woods, totally making a mockery of climate change and the fires. It's like we live in a circus. My head hurts sometimes when I think about it.
So thank you for, I guess, supporting my work by having me on your program and letting us talk about a whole range of things and letting me send you those pictures of my wave cut platform just 5 minutes before you started recording this. So thanks for the discussion. That's exceedingly that's one way of supporting me. But I guess in terms of this Beige Reef film and the next one, that work's supported by the B. McPhee Family Foundation. So I am very privileged to be getting some financial support from that philanthropist. In terms of what people might be able to do right now to support the skeptic cause, What's Up With That great blog site has been very supportive of me for a long time. And I know Charles Rotter's been basically running that while Anthony Watts has taken some time out. So maybe if people went and right now donated at What's Up With That and put a note for Charles, because he's really worked overtime at What's Up With That over the last year to keep getting stories out. So maybe a donation at What's Up With That, that blog site, normally run by Anthony Watts, but run by Charles over the last year. A donation for Charles.
Excellent. So everyone out there, watch Beige Reef. It's only 12 minutes long. Share it on all your social media platforms. Jennifer, you're also a co-author on a bunch of books where people can get on Amazon, including the last time you were on, you were in a textbook. What is that? The climate book? What was that?
So Climate Change, the Facts, 2017. I've usually got a copy handy. Where is it on my desk? And
of course, we're talking about facts, so that you're going to freeze up. So if you could just reiterate, Climate Change, the Facts, the book, what's it about?
So it's got about 20 chapters, and they're most of them are, they're a whole range of different topics by some well-known skeptics. Willie Soon, Roy Spencer. We've also, Bob Carter's got a chapter in there. So that book came out about 3 years ago. Well, it did come out 3 years ago now. It sold really well. We've sold more than 30,000 copies, which is a phenomenal number of copies to sell. We're doing another book in that series, Climate Change, the Facts 2020. It's going to come out later this year, and it's going to have a different lineup of authors. So we'll have Donna Laframboise writing a chapter with Susan Crockford about the polar bear situation, and of course polar bear numbers are going up rather than coming down. We're going to have a chapter in there about sunspots by Valentina Zarkova. We've got a chapter in there by Richard Lindzen. We're going to have 2 chapters by Peter Reid. I'm going to be writing about recordings of temperatures in Australia and how 3 different things happen. They remodel the data, they delete some of the early record, and also problems with lack of calibration with current probes. Look, there's going to be another 20 chapters, very diverse, a little bit technical, but mostly written for the educated lay reader. So that book will be coming out later in the year. Maybe you could have me back on again when that book's published, and I can show everybody a picture of it and the cover of it, and they can buy it. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. That sounds perfect. And for those of you out there, support Jennifer. Go over to her website, jennifermarohasy.com. Watch Beige Reef. Share it with your friends. Go make a donation over at What's Up With That. And we share that website all the time. And always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know you got to run out right away. We love you over here, and keep up the good work, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.